When you think back on all of the great game composers that scored our childhoods, one name that inevitably must come to mind is Kirk Hope. Donkey Kong 64, GoldenEye, and of course Banjo-Kazooie stand at the top tier of the N64 catalog, both as games and as soundtracks, and cemented Kirk Hope's place in the Game Composer Hall of Fame. Since the golden era of the late 90s, Kirk Hope stayed busy, working for the last decade or so as a freelancer, composing for loads of games, including the excellent Mario & Rabbids Kingdom Battle, and, of course, the spiritual successor to the original Banjo-Kazooie games, Yooka-Laylee. No revival of the Banjo-Kazooie cartoony collectathon style would be complete without Kirk Hope's music, but with nearly 20 years between the two games' releases, how much has changed in Kirk Hope's writing style? How much of that iconic Banjo-Kazooie sound is present in the music of Yooka-Laylee? Let's break down some core elements of the Banjo-Kazooie soundtrack and see where Yooka-Laylee takes these elements and where it expands upon them. First, let's break down the basic style of the Banjo-Kazooie soundtrack. The rhythm and melody of each tune in the game is written in a very light-hearted, cartoonish style with bouncy oompa rhythms and simple singable melodies heard throughout the game's score. This is a deliberate way to sneak a series of jarringly dissonant chord progressions past the ears of unsuspecting children. The harmony throughout the Banjo-Kazooie soundtrack is constantly subverting your expectations by throwing chords from way outside the key at you with no warning. Take Mumbo's Mountain, for example. The core musical idea of the piece is the sudden jump from our tonic C chord down to an F-sharp major chord, dropped into an otherwise completely standard chord progression. What makes this shift sound so drastic is the use of the tritone. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the tritone is the interval found a raised fourth or flattened fifth above a root note, and it's generally considered to be one of the most dissonant intervals. You can think of two chords a tritone apart from each other as being like musical opposites. Two keys a tritone apart will have as few notes in common between them as possible, so they're as far apart harmonically as it gets. Kirk Hope has mentioned in interviews how he specifically used the tritone relationship when writing the music for Banjo-Kazooie to represent how the two titular characters have completely opposite personalities from one another. In Mumbo's Mountain, we don't just jump between C and F-sharp chords to get that signature tritone jank. The effect is emphasized by the melody's drop-down of a tritone from E to A sharp, powering up the jarring harmonic shift by pairing it with a jarring melodic one. Treasure Trove Cove, another piece in C major, modulates suddenly to the key of F sharp for its second section for a little tritone jolt. Once in the key of F sharp, the melody sets an expectation with a relatively straightforward 4-bar phrase. With the exception of this D7 chord, the dominant flat 6 in the key, which is another one of Kirk Hope's go-to dissonant chords by the way, these first 4 bars use a very simple chord progression going from the 1 to the 4, back to the 1 chord, and then a dominant 2-5 setup for a return to the 1 for the second phrase. The melody sticks to this chord progression like glue, landing squarely on the root of almost every chord and bouncing happily around the chord tones in each bar. The expectation created from this phrase is obliterated when we come to the second phrase, which leaps suddenly from F sharp to a C chord a tritone away, then slides up to the 5 chord, C sharp, before jumping another tritone to a G chord that resolves to another C. Notice how throughout all of this, the melody retains its bouncy, chord tone focused approach. Usually I find melodies that are so focused on just outlining the underlying chord progression kind of bland, but in this case the harmony is so colorful and exciting that it serves the song to have the melody just drawing more attention to the chord progression. The simple nature of the melodies in the game combined with the upbeat rhythms and the crazy harmony create a musical identity that is truly, and I don't use this word lightly, zany. It all feels very cartoonish, but it's more like Animaniacs than Peppa Pig, if that makes sense. Yooka-Laylee's soundtrack makes use of the same basic compositional strategy, with the tritone featuring prominently among a series of adventurous harmonic shifts underscoring simple, singable melodies. In Frosty Fray, the melody is based off a figure extremely similar to the one we just saw in Treasure Trove Cove, this time outlining an alternating A minor to F progression. After 4 bars, we get a sudden drop down to an E-flat minor chord, a tritone away from our root, before jolting back to our tonic A minor. Where Yooka-Laylee takes things a step further from the classic Banjo-Kazooie style is in the breadth of harmonic ideas Kirk Hope uses. Where Banjo's soundtrack would drop in one weird chord here and there and change keys really suddenly, Yooka's soundtrack will string together longer sequences of chords that toss you around from one tonality to another like you're riding a musical mechanical bull. The following phrase subverts the expectation set by the first phrase by landing on an F minor chord in bar 4 rather than an F major chord, a dark harmonic shift known as a chromatic mediant. A chromatic mediant relationship between 2 chords just means that the 2 chords' roots are a third away from each other and they share only one note in common between them. This is another common harmonic trick Kirk Hope uses to catch you off guard. This shifts to a D to A flat to E7 progression that sets up a return to our tonic A minor. The whole section is technically an A minor, but each of these chords clashes so hard with the chords before and after it that if you just looked at these 4 bars in isolation, I really doubt anybody would be able to correctly guess what key the piece is supposed to be in. I especially love that sustained sharp 4th over the A-flat chord, the D note held over from the previous bar that resolves down to the 3rd of the chord C. Besides just sounding dope, this kind of thing sounds to my ears a little more mature than what you would typically find on the Banjo-Kazooie soundtrack. In Moody Marsh from Yooka-Laylee, the harmonic twists and turns are taken to the extreme. We're in the key of F minor now, with slow string stabs and a low bass clarinet melody creating a kind of silly, kind of spooky atmosphere. Think haunted house ride vibes. The melody makes heavy use of the note a tritone away from the root, dropping a big fat B natural on beat 3 of each of the first 3 bars of the main theme. In a sense, it's the same compositional idea that we heard in Banjo-Kazooie's Mumbo's Mountain theme, a straightforward melody in the home key diving to an out-of-key note on beat 3 to accentuate the jarring chromatic shift in the harmony. In the case of Moody Marsh, however, Kirk Hope uses a much broader harmonic palette to create these jarring shifts. The first B natural in each melodic phrase is harmonized with an E minor chord, sliding down by a half step from our tonic F minor and back up for the next bar. This low B natural is harmonized by a B minor chord, the chord found a tritone away from our tonic. On the second 4-bar phrase, we leap instead to an E natural harmonized by a D flat minor chord, another chromatic mediant relationship just like we saw in Frosty Fray. Altogether, this means that this theme spends almost just as much time on chords pulled from very distant keys as it does in the home key of F minor. In a case like this where you have chords back to back that clash with one another, a lot of composers would choose melody notes that fit with both chords to smooth the transition between the 2 harmonies. Kirk Hope does the exact opposite, accentuating the differences between 2 chords by having the melody target the notes in each chord that have the most dramatic effect. He even mentioned that he does this deliberately in an interview with my buddy Matt Kenyon of the podcast Composer Code.
But I'm not sort of a great melody pop in my head. I'm more like, here's a set of chords, I'll try and weave a melody in between it. In my head, I look for the odd note, the note that's a bit weird. Like, so if I was playing C major and A flat major as a thing, I'd be looking at the E and the E flat. I like that thing. So I look for that odd note. So, and even though it's not odd, it's just the way that my brain looks at it, but that's how I see it. Mm-hmm. So I look for the slightly odd note that I can weave it in there and it's mold it into the chord sequence, and it just gives it that extra bit of quirkiness, that extra bit of catchiness. So it's slightly odd, but it fits.
For example, check out the melody to Shipwreck Creek from Yooka-Laylee. In the key of D, we have a 4-bar progression of D to E over D to A flat to D. The melody is once again a simple, bouncy figure that emphasizes the chord tones of each chord on the strong beats of each bar, but it makes a point to shift by a half step in between each bar to hit the note of the new chord that most clashes with the previous chord. A drops down to G sharp for this E over D, which is the note found a tritone above the root of the previous D. Then an E drops down to an E flat for the following A flat chord, E flat being the only note in the A flat triad that couldn't fit at all with the previous E over D chord. The A flat in the melody at the end of this bar slides up a half step to an A for the final bar of D major, clashing deliberately with the root note of the previous bar's A flat chord. The melody here makes sure you really feel the shift in tonality moving through each chord. Imagine an alternate universe where Grant Kirk Hope is less interesting, where he decided to try and target the safest notes in between each chord change. Maybe he'd walk up to the E for this E over D chord, as that fits pretty seamlessly into this kind of scalar D major figure. Then maybe he'd stay on the G sharp of the E over D chord moving into the bar of A flat, since that's enharmonically the root of the new chord, to smoothen out this transition. For this A flat chord, you could target the dominant 7th of the chord and stick to that note over the change to D major, watching the same note become the 3rd of our tonic chord. Now, how would that sound? Not nearly as fun, that's how. Kirk Hope's more dramatic approach to writing melodies like this is a big part of these games' distinct musical identities. Another element of Kirk Hope's writing style that I want to touch on is harmonic sequences, or transitionary sections of music that throw a bunch of different chords from a bunch of different keys at you all in a row. This is kind of an extension of the tritone surprise style of chord progression that we've looked at so far, where the point is to surprise the listener. But these harmonic sequences take this to the next level by being so long and so unexpected that the listener loses their sense of where the home key is. This makes these sequences work really well as transitions between two different keys, because landing in a definite key center is a big relief after being tossed around with no ground to stand on, even if that key center is pretty far away from where the piece was before the transition. You can find a couple small examples of this in the original Banjo-Kazooie soundtrack. A transition in Bubble Gloop Swamp features a 3-bar pattern where triadic arpeggios take us through a series of wildly differing chords. We bounce between tritone buddies C and F sharp for a bar, then move in chromatic mediants for the C to A flat to E bit, before jumping a tritone to B flat, a minor third up to D flat, and then mimicking the first bar's tritone trading with a bar of D flat moving to G. Ending on a G sets up a return to the top of the pattern starting on C, and it repeats for another 3 bars doubled an octave higher. This quick barrage of chords definitely makes you lose your tonal footing. It's almost impossible to keep holding on to the main key of C throughout this transition. However, it's only 6 bars long and transitions between 2 repetitions of the same section in C major. In Yooka-Laylee, you can see this harmonic sequence idea fleshed out into much more elaborate examples, bearing clear influence from the great film composers of the late 20th century like John Williams and Danny Elfman. In Frosty Fray, we get a transition out of the key of B minor, featuring pounding strings and a frantic piccolo melody that uses a distinct harmonic pattern. The pattern starts on a minor chord, then moves to the major 2 chord over the original minor chord's root note. This sequence is then moved up in minor thirds, giving us a B minor to C sharp over B, to D minor to E over D, to F minor to G over F, to A flat minor to B flat over A flat. The final B flat over A flat acts as a 3rd inversion dominant chord leading to the next section in E flat minor. we've successfully transitioned from the key of B minor to the key of E flat minor, two pretty distant keys in a very dramatic way. This isn't just longer and more complicated than our Bubble Gloop Swamp example, it also has a clearer underlying unifying logic to it. This logic isn't so obvious on first listen, there isn't a repeating melodic figure or anything like that to spell it out for you, so you still feel like you're getting swept along on a harmonic roller coaster ride. But I think the stronger structure makes this transition feel more sophisticated than the more erratic transition we saw from the Banjo-Kazooie soundtrack. While the writing in Yooka-Laylee might be a bit more complex and cinematic than in Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo's soundtrack definitely has a rhythmic energy throughout it that you don't see as much in its spiritual successor. There's a wider variety of orchestral textures and a broader palette of harmonic and melodic ideas on display, but there's nothing in the Yooka-Laylee soundtrack with the same grinning, juvenile energy of, say, the Banjo-Kazooie main theme. Here, listen to the two main themes back to back to see what I mean. So I wouldn't say that one soundtrack is better than the other, it's really up to your personal taste and your level of nostalgic attachment. Well, there you go. Yooka-Laylee's soundtrack seems to me to take the basic compositional attitude and elements from Banjo-Kazooie's legendary score, specifically the use of the tritone and generally surprising harmonic shifts, melodies that outline the harmony and target the most dramatic notes in each new chord, and harmonic sequences that transition between sections, and imbue all of these techniques with an extra level of sophistication that Grant Kirkhope has acquired in his last 20 years of experience writing music for games, even if it loses some of that frantic rhythmic energy that made the original soundtrack so fun. Hopefully you found that as fun and enlightening to watch as I found it to make. Big thanks to Jonathan Garcia, Red Hollow, and Nick Shadle for requesting this video on my Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel and join the company of these fine folks here, then please consider checking out my Patreon page here. You can also follow me on Twitter at 8BitMusicTheory, but God knows why you would. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.